In a moment that began as a chance meeting, a wealthy man's heart softened when he saw his paralyzed daughter embraced by a maid's child, spinning together in innocent joy. What happened next was unexpected and unforgettable. The millionaire's mansion was alive that evening with music, laughter, and glittering lights. Crystal chandeliers cast golden ripples across polished marble floors, while guests in gowns and tuxedos raised glasses of champagne, exchanging pleasantries and stories of power, influence, and wealth. The ballroom was designed to impress, a cathedral of opulence where even the silence shimmered with affluence. And yet, amid all this grandeur, a quiet sadness lingered. At the far end of the room, in a chair positioned near the edge of the dance floor, sat the millionaire's daughter. Her beauty was undeniable, wide eyes framed with lashes that seemed almost too delicate for this world, but her legs lay motionless beneath her dress. Since the accident years ago, she had lived with paralysis, unable to join the world on her own terms. She was adored by her father, cherished by the staff, but often looked at with pity by strangers. Tonight was no different. As couples swirled past her, she sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, trying to smile but unable to hide the shadow in her eyes. She loved music, always had. She longed to dance, to feel the rhythm course through her body, to twirl and spin until laughter bubbled out of her chest. But music now was only something she could watch, never truly experience. Across the room, unnoticed by most of the guests, stood a little girl in a simple dress. She was the maid's daughter, brought quietly along because her mother couldn't leave her alone at home. Unlike the glittering children of wealth who flitted through the ballroom, she had no jewels, no silks, no tutors to guide her in etiquette. But what she had was something far rarer: innocence untouched by judgment, and a heart wide open. As the orchestra swelled into a gentle waltz, her eyes fell on the millionaire's daughter. She saw not the chair, not the still legs, not the wealth surrounding her. She saw only another girl, sitting alone while everyone else danced. So she did something no one else had dared. She walked across the room. The crowd didn't notice at first, too wrapped up in their own elegance, but those close enough to see gasped softly, watching as the maid's child, with her hair tied back by a faded ribbon, extended a hand to the paralyzed girl. The millionaire's daughter blinked in surprise. No one had ever asked her to dance before, not since the accident, not since her world had shifted. She hesitated, eyes wide, then whispered, "I can't." But the maid's daughter only smiled, her voice gentle and unwavering. "Then let's dance another way." She took her hand and began to sway, guiding her arms in rhythm with the music. At first it was awkward, the millionaire's daughter uncertain and shy, but then something extraordinary happened. Her laughter, real, unrestrained, broke free. She lifted her arms, moving them as if conducting the orchestra, while the maid's child spun beside her, twirling as though they were partners in a grand ballet. Slowly, the music seemed to shift around them. The chatter quieted. One by one, heads turned. The glittering guests, the waiters with trays, even the musicians themselves paused as the two girls moved together, a dance not of legs and steps, but of joy and courage. And across the ballroom, the millionaire froze. He had been engaged in polite conversation, nodding absently as someone bragged about stocks, but now his gaze locked onto his daughter. His breath caught, her face was glowing, her eyes alight, her laughter echoing across the marble. It was a sound he hadn't heard in so long that it made his chest ache. The maid's daughter twirled again, her ribbon flying, then leaned close to whisper something that made the paralyzed girl smile brighter than ever. To the guests, it was a scene both shocking and humbling. To the millionaire, it was a revelation. He realized in that single moment that his daughter wasn't broken. She wasn't incomplete. She simply needed someone who would see her, not her chair, someone who would dare to ask her to dance. And for the first time in years, his heart stirred with a hope he thought he had lost. The orchestra's melody carried softly through the grand ballroom, but for the millionaire, every note now sounded different. His gaze was fixed on his daughter, who just minutes ago had been sitting silently in her wheelchair, her face dulled by polite smiles that hid her loneliness. Now she was transformed. Her arms swayed gracefully in time with the music, her laughter ringing out like silver bells. Across from her, the maid's daughter twirled and spun, her faded ribbon flying, her shoes barely keeping up with her own excitement. Together, the two girls created a rhythm all their own, one not bound by tradition, etiquette, or the steps of a waltz, but by something deeper. It was a dance of imagination. The paralyzed girl waved her hands as if painting notes in the air, and her partner mirrored those movements, spinning with every flick, bowing with every sweep. The child who had once sat on the sidelines of life was suddenly the conductor of her own music. The guests were stunned. At first, whispers darted through the crowd like startled birds. "Who is that girl? The maid's daughter? She shouldn't be on the floor." But as the minutes passed, the murmurs gave way to silence. Even the most self-important guest, even the ones who might have scoffed at impropriety, couldn't look away. Because what unfolded before them wasn't improper. It was as pure. The millionaire felt something inside him crack open. His daughter's smile, so wide it nearly glowed, was one he hadn't seen since before the accident. The weight of grief that had pressed against his heart for years seemed to lift, replaced by something fragile but undeniable. Hope. For so long he had tried to heal her with things money could buy. He had built ramps and elevators, purchased advanced medical equipment, hired specialists and therapists. He had surrounded her with comfort, with luxury, with safety. But none of it had reached her the way this moment did. Because what his daughter needed was not wealth, but connection. Tears blurred his vision as he stepped closer, ignoring the startled looks of guests. Every movement of his daughter's hands, every spin of the maid's child, carved deeper into him. This was not pity, this was not charity, this was joy. Two children from different worlds, united by music and innocence, were teaching an entire room of adults what it meant to truly live. The song reached its crescendo. The maid's daughter took her friend's hand and bowed dramatically, and the paralyzed girl lifted her chin with regal pride, responding with a playful wave of her hand. The room erupted, not with polite applause, but with genuine clapping, cheers, even tears. For once, the spotlight wasn't on the grandeur of the mansion or the power of wealth. It was on a bond between two children who had dared to dance when no one else would. The millionaire could no longer hold back. He crossed the ballroom floor, his steps uneven with emotion, and knelt beside his daughter. She turned to him, her face flushed with happiness, her eyes sparkling. "Papa," she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. "Did you see? I danced." And he gathered her into his arms, his tears falling freely as he pressed his forehead to hers. "Yes," he choked out. "I saw. You danced more beautifully than anyone in this room ever could." And he gathered her into his arms, his tears falling freely as he pressed his forehead to hers. "Yes," he choked out. "I saw. You danced more beautifully than anyone in this room ever could." Then, turning to the maid's daughter, he reached for her hand. For a moment she looked frightened, as though she had overstepped some unspoken boundary, but his grip was gentle, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice breaking. "You gave her back what I thought was gone forever." Around them the music faded, but no one moved. The ballroom had witnessed more than a performance that night. It had witnessed a miracle, not one of medicine or money, but of courage, kindness, and the unshakable truth that joy can bloom in even the most unexpected places. And though the waltz had ended, the rhythm it awakened was only just beginning. The ballroom had never felt so still. For a moment, time seemed suspended, as though the golden chandeliers themselves were holding their breath. The millionaire knelt beside his daughter, his fine suit pressed against the marble floor, and all around him, the glittering guests could only watch in silence. He didn't care about the stares, he didn't care about protocol, about the judgment that might come from mingling too closely with the maid's child. In that instant, the world narrowed to two faces, his daughter's, flushed with joy, and the little girl's, shy but shining with courage. For years, he had thought of himself as a man who could solve anything. Money had built him an empire, bought him influence, and opened every door. Yet money could not restore his daughter's legs. It could not mend her broken laughter or breathe light back into the places grief had dimmed. But here, this child with no fortune, no pedigree, no silk dress, had done what all his wealth could not. She had given his daughter joy, not the tempo, rarey, surface-level joy of gifts and gadgets, but the real kind, the kind that lit her eyes and made her forget her chair, her limits, her loss. His chest ached with both sorrow and gratitude. He had been so blind, so consumed by trying to protect his daughter from the world, that he had forgotten to let her live in it. He had thought she was fragile glass to be placed on a shelf and kept safe, but tonight he saw her for what she truly was, strong, radiant, still capable of laughter, of dancing, just in her own way. And all it took was someone willing to see her as more than her chair. He turned to the maid's daughter, who stood nervously beside her mother now. The maid had stepped forward, face pale with fear. She was certain her daughter had ruined everything. She knew how the wealthy could be, how quickly kindness could turn to fury if a servant's child overstepped her place. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Sir, I'm so sorry. She didn't mean—" But before she could finish, the millionaire rose to his feet, still holding his daughter's hand, and looked directly at the maid. His voice, when it came, was heavy with emotion but steady as steel. "Do not apologize," he said. The words rang across the ballroom, silencing even the faintest whisper. He looked at the little girl again, his eyes wet. "Your daughter has given me more than all the wealth in this house ever could. She gave my child back her smile." The maid covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Her daughter, wide-eyed, looked from the millionaire to his daughter, unsure if she was in trouble or being praised. So he knelt again, this time before the maid's child, lowering himself to her level in front of everyone. Gasps fluttered through the guests at the sight of a man of such status humbling himself before a servant's daughter. But he didn't care. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You reminded me what it means to live. You reminded her what it means to dance, and you reminded all of us what truly matters." The girl blinked, then smiled. Small at first, then wide, bright enough to challenge even the chandeliers above them. In that instant, something shifted in the room. The walls of class, wealth, and status, so carefully built over generations, seemed to crack. The guests who had come expecting another night of glitter and luxury were left instead with the raw truth of humanity. Joy knows no rank, love knows no wealth, and healing often comes from the most unexpected places. The millionaire lifted his daughter into his arms. She leaned against him, her tiny hands wrapped around his neck, her face still glowing. "Papa," she whispered, her voice soft but fierce with conviction. "She's my friend." And with tears streaming down his cheeks, he nodded. "Yes, she is, and she always will be." The days following the ballroom event changed everything in the millionaire's mansion. What began as a spontaneous dance between two children became the spark for something larger, something deeper. For the first time in years, the house felt alive, not with the cold hum of wealth, but with the warmth of connection. The millionaire could not forget the image of his daughter's radiant smile as she danced with the maid's child. He had replayed it in his mind over and over again. That joy wasn't fleeting. It had left an imprint, and he wasn't willing to let it fade. So, he made a decision. He invited the maid and her daughter to spend more time in the heart of the household, not just in the servants' quarters, not hidden away in the background, but as companions, as family. At first the maid hesitated. She had spent her entire life walking carefully along the invisible line that separated her world from her employer's. To step across it felt dangerous, even forbidden. But when she looked at her daughter, so eager to visit, to laugh, to play with her new friend, she couldn't bring herself to say no. The first invitation was simple: dinner. That evening, the maid and her daughter sat at the long dining table usually reserved for dignitaries and investors. The little girl's eyes widened at the shining silverware, the crystal glasses, the way the chandelier reflected like stars in the polished wood. She felt out of place at first, her small hands trembling as she picked up the fork, but the millionaire's daughter reached across the table, holding her hand with an unspoken promise: "You belong here." From that night on, the two girls were inseparable. They painted together in the sunny rooms overlooking the gardens. They told stories under the towering oak tree in the courtyard. They invented games, laughed until their sides hurt, and whispered secrets late into the evenings. For the paralyzed girl, it was as though a daughter life had been flung open. She no longer felt like a fragile ornament trapped in a cage of pity. For the maid's daughter, it was a world of possibility she had never imagined. Books, toys, gardens, and, most importantly, a true friend who valued her not for status, but for heart. The millionaire watched quietly, his emotions often overwhelming him. It wasn't just that his daughter was happy again, it was that she was free. Free to be herself, to live fully, even in ways her chair had once seemed to forbid. And it was all because a child from humble beginnings had the courage to treat her like any other girl. In time, the bond between the children wove itself into the fabric of the two families. The maid, once just an employee, was welcomed at the table, her voice respected in household matters. She felt the strange weight of years of distance lifting. This was no longer a house of two worlds, but one, and for the millionaire, something inside him softened. For so long, he had lived behind walls of pride and wealth, convinced that money could fix, control, or protect everything. But now he realized the truth. Wealth had built the walls, but love, simple, unguarded love, was what could tear them down. Guests who visited the mansion noticed the change. They no longer found a silent, somber child at the corner of the ballroom. Instead, they saw two girls, laughing, plotting adventures, sharing inside jokes. Their joy was contagious, spilling into every corner of the house. Even the staff felt it, their work suddenly lighter, their smiles easier. The millionaire's daughter was no longer the girl in the chair. She was a sister, a leader, a friend, and the maid's daughter was no longer just a servant's child. She was family. Together, they had built something no ballroom, no wealth, no fortune could ever match, a bond born not from status but from love, and for the millionaire, it was the greatest treasure he had ever known. The millionaire's mansion had changed. No longer was it simply a monument to wealth filled with polished stone and glittering chandeliers. It had become a home alive with laughter, music, and the footsteps of children racing through its long corridors. The bond between his daughter and the maid's child was undeniable, and every day it grew stronger. But for the millionaire, gratitude alone wasn't enough. He had always been a man of action. If wealth had given him influence, then it was time to use that influence for something greater than boardrooms and business ventures. He wanted to honor what those two children had created, a friendship that defied barriers of status, ability, and circumstance. It began with small steps. He arranged for the maid's daughter to have access to the same tutors as his own child. She deserves every opportunity to learn and grow, he said firmly, brushing aside anyone who suggested otherwise. When he saw the girl's eyes light up as she read her first storybook under the guidance of a private teacher, he knew he had made the right choice. But he didn't stop there. He noticed how much the two girls loved music and movement. His daughter couldn't dance in the traditional sense, but with her friend's encouragement she had discovered new ways of expressing rhythm, through her arms, her laughter, her imagination. So he funded a new program in the city, a community dance and art center designed to welcome children of all abilities, regardless of their background. The announcement stunned his peers. A millionaire spending his fortune not on another luxury development, but on children's programs. Some scoffed, dismissing it as a publicity stunt. But the truth was clear to those who knew. This was no act of vanity. It was a father's way of paying forward the gift that had been given to him. At the opening ceremony of the center, he stood before the crowd with both girls at his side. His daughter, radiant in her chair, held her friend's hand tightly, as though drawing strength from their bond. Reporters snapped photos, flashes of light bouncing off their faces, but the moment was far more intimate than it appeared. "I once believed," the millionaire said, his voice carrying through the crowd, "that wealth could buy everything, solutions, happiness, even healing. But my daughter taught me otherwise. She taught me that what truly matters cannot be purchased, it must be shared, and sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change a life more profoundly than all the riches in the world." The audience erupted in applause, but the most powerful reaction came from his daughter. She leaned forward, smiling at her friend, and whispered, "We did this together." From that day on, the center became a beacon in the community. Children of all walks of life, some wealthy, some poor, some able-bodied, some with disabilities, found common ground in its classrooms. They painted murals, learned instruments, practiced dances where every child had a role, whether on their feet or in a chair. And often, when the millionaire visited, he saw his daughter and the maid's daughter leading the group, two children who had unknowingly sparked a movement of solidarity. The mansion was no longer just a home. The city was no longer just a place of business. Both had become stages for a new legacy, one where love, compassion, and equality danced louder than money ever could. Seasons changed. But the memory of that night in the ballroom, the night a maid's daughter invited a millionaire's child to dance, never faded. It had not only changed two little girls but had reshaped the lives of everyone connected to them. The mansion was different now. It was no longer a symbol of power meant to intimidate guests with its grandeur. Instead, it had become a place alive with warmth. The marble floors still gleamed, the chandeliers still sparkled, but the true brilliance of the home came from the laughter that echoed down its halls. Every evening the two girls could be found together, studying, playing, inventing new dances that blended imagination with joy. Sometimes they wheeled through the gardens, chasing butterflies. Other times they sat curled up with books, whispering stories only they understood. They were sisters in every way that mattered, bound not by blood, but by choice. The millionaire often watched them in quiet awe. He had gained fortunes in his life, closed impossible deals, and built empires. But no victory had ever felt as profound as this, seeing his daughter thriving, not because of money, but because of friendship. The bond between the children had grown into something larger, a bond between their families. The maid, once hesitant to step out of her role, now found herself treated with genuine respect. She no longer lowered her eyes in her employer's presence. Instead, she joined him in conversation, her voice valued, her wisdom sought. It was a shift not just in the household but in the millionaire himself. He had learned humility not through lectures or loss of fortune, but through the innocent kindness of a child who reminded him what mattered. He realized wealth was not meant to build walls, it was meant to open doors. And so, he kept opening them. The community center he had established flourished. Children of every background came to its doors, some in wheelchairs, some with hearing aids, some carrying burdens that had nothing to do with their bodies but everything to do with the weight of poverty or broken homes, and in that center they found belonging. The millionaire's daughter and the maid's daughter often attended together, not as a display of status but as equals. They were the heart of the place, the reminder to every child who entered, you are seen, you are loved, you are part of this dance. Their friendship had ignited something bigger than themselves. Parents who once would never have spoken to one another now exchanged warm greetings as they dropped off their children. Teachers found inspiration in the way the girls encouraged each other, refusing to see disability or poverty as limitations. Even the wealthiest families in the city, who once prided themselves on exclusivity, began to notice the power of inclusion. It wasn't perfect. There were still skeptics, critics, and those who muttered about boundaries being blurred. But for every voice of doubt, there were 10 voices rising in celebration. The movement had momentum, fueled not by speeches or money, but by genuine love. One evening, as the sun set behind the mansion's tall windows, the millionaire's daughter sat with her father in the garden. Her chair was parked beside his bench, and together they watched fireflies drift through the twilight. "Papa," she said softly, "do you think people will always remember?" He looked at her, puzzled. "Remember what, my darling?" "The dance, that night, how it changed everything." The millionaire smiled, his eyes misting with pride. He placed a hand over hers and said, "They won't just remember the night, they'll remember what it taught us. That every person, no matter who they are, has the power to change a life. And you, my love, will carry that lesson with you forever." She leaned into him, comforted. Across the lawn, the maid's daughter was laughing as she chased fireflies with a jar, her ribbon glowing in the dusk. The millionaire closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the quiet peace that now filled his home, a peace born not of wealth, but of empathy. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that this was only the beginning of their story. For they had not just created a friendship, they had created a new chapter, one where walls of class and circumstance fell, and where love taught everyone who witnessed it the simplest truth of all. When you open your heart, the world dances with you.